evening, everybody. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce Lester Paquin and Lucy Allen, members of the Barrie Historical Society, who will share with us Desperate Hours, the Loss of the Andrea Doria. I have seen this presentation and was amazed at the information these historians have gathered for this program, so I know you're going to be delighted with it. Please give a warm welcome to our guest speakers.
Oh, thank you, Jeanette, and thank you for the invitation to be here. We are deeply honored. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you all for coming. We really look forward to being here and doing this for you. I have a little bit of breaking news in my hand. Just yesterday, the world's largest ocean liner was delivered to Royal Caribbean. It is called the Symphony of the Seas. It weighs 228,000 tons. It's 1,188 feet long, 238 feet high. It has 18 decks. It can carry 6,680 passengers, 2,200 crew members. It has an ice rink, a water park, a full-size basketball court, and 2,700 cabins. It has also a 43-foot rock climbing wall. The cost to build this ship, $1.35 billion. Now, the Andrea Doria, it was quite not in this league, and you get to the point where ships aren't really ships anymore. They're just hotels that manage to float. Now, before I begin, I would like to thank my friend and producer, Lucy Allen, for the invaluable gift of her friendship, time, and technical assistance in preparing this program. She is a fellow historian, an eminent genealogist, and her help to me now has been especially appreciated. We gather to remember a certain summer evening 61 years ago. We are also here to recall the destinies of two magnificent and proud ocean liners, their crews, their passengers, their rescuers, and their legacies. The year is 1956, and I'm not going to ask any of you if you remember 1956. Some of you have already confessed, but anyway. Eisenhower is in the White House, and Khrushchev is in the Kremlin. War is over in Korea and beginning in Vietnam. And another conflict, the Cold War, is heating up. Actress Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier of Monaco are newly married. Peyton Place, Profiles in Courage, and A Night to Remember about the sinking of the Titanic. They are topping the bestseller lists. Fins are appearing on America's cars, and Elvis Presley is becoming a household word. It is also an Olympics year, and Egypt is flexing its muscles by seizing the Suez Canal. In short, it's the height of the fabulous 50s. And nowhere is this phenomenon more acutely demonstrated than on the high seas, as the long era of travel by ocean liner is coming to an end, due to the speed and efficiency of air transport. Going out in style, transatlantic passenger ships are sparing no expense to lure customers to their sleek decks and comfortable staterooms. Entertainment and cuisine are star attractions for the rich and famous, while the cost of ocean passage remains reasonable for those whose lives and homes are in transition. One of the most celebrated ocean liners of the day is the Italian line's Andrea Doria, which, along with its slightly younger sister ship, the Cristoforo Colombo, are the epitome of style, grace, and speed in the post-war era. Italy's pride, these twins joined the likes of the RMS Queen Mary, the RMS Queen Elizabeth, the Ile-de-France, and the SS United States in vying for the attention and patronage of transatlantic travelers. Now let's begin by stating that the Andrea Doria's namesake is a man, not a woman, a fact made more difficult to remember because ships are always referred to with feminine pronouns. Admiral Andrea Doria lived in the 16th century, fighting for and against Italian princes, for and against France, and consistently against the Turks and the Barbary pirates. He commanded warships powered by shackled prisoners below decks, while sailors did battle on the upper decks with swords and cannons. In 1528, at the age of 62, Andrea Doria directed an amphibious assault that drove the French garrison out of Genoa, reestablishing the Republic after nearly a century of domination by foreign powers. He refused to become head of state, though he made sure his homeland would never again fall under enemy control in his lifetime. He died in November 1560, 5 days short of his 94th birthday. Andrea Doria and Christopher Columbus are Genoa's two most revered heroes. And so, when it came time for the Italian line to christen its two new luxury liners, the names of these men were natural choices. The liner Andrea Doria was built in the Ansaldo shipyards in Genoa, Italy, beginning in June 1951 at a cost of $29 million. The ship was 697 feet long, 11 stories high, and weighed 29,100 tons. Her maximum speed was 25 knots, or the equivalent of 30 miles an hour. Because of her engineering and construction, she was considered unsinkable. Does that sound familiar? She embarked on her maiden voyage to New York in January of 1953. When she was built and throughout her career, the Andrea Doria was always more than just a ship to the people of Italy. She represented that nation's pride and emergence from the horrors and degradation of World War II. Not merely a conveyance, she became a symbol of grace and elegance for an entire country, and her people took her to their hearts and never let go. And in the greater world, the Doria was an instant hit. She was uniformly regarded as the most gorgeous ocean liner of the day, both in exterior lines, which evoked an illusion of movement even while in port, and in her decor. The Italian line proudly touted the Doria as, quote, a living testament to the importance of beauty in the everyday world, end quote. And they also termed it a floating art gallery. She blended modern technology, she featured air conditioning throughout, and modern artistic touches such as exotic blonde wood panels and surrealistic murals and works of art reflecting Italy's artistic heritage. These masterpieces included oil paintings, statuary, and artifacts from ancient Rome and Pompeii. In all, the artwork aboard ship alone was valued at more than $1 million in 1956 currency. On Tuesday, July 17, 1956, the Andrea Doria left Genoa on its 101st 9-day Atlantic crossing. She carried 1,134 passengers, 572 officers and crew, 401 tons of freight, several automobiles, 7 dogs, 4 cats, 522 pieces of luggage, and 1,754 bags of mail. This is a bronze statue of Admiral Andrea Doria from the 1500s, taking pride of place in the ship's first-class lounge. Note the surrealistic murals behind it. Recently, I attended an exhibition at the Peabody Essex Museum in Peabody, Salem rather, titled Ocean Liners, Glamour, Speed, and Style. Did anybody happen to see that? You did. It was incredible. Among the incredible artifacts on display was a wall panel from the Andrea Doria's Zodiac Room. It measured about 3 feet wide by 7 feet high, and was decorated with several colorful and abstractly rendered zodiac symbols and star patterns. These were painted on masonite, which was in turn affixed to a plywood backing. The incredible thing about this piece of wall material was that it somehow was torn from the Doria's interior during the collision and swept out to sea. Several weeks later, the panel washed up on a beach in Nantucket, where it was retrieved and subsequently given to the Nantucket Historical Society, which loaned it to the Peabody Essex for its exhibition. Other than a few water stains, the panel is in remarkable shape and is in one of the largest and most fragile relics from the Andrea Doria in existence. This is Ruth Roman, a native of Lynn, Massachusetts, and perhaps the Doria's most famous passenger on its final voyage. She's here striking a pose with the Admiral. At age 32, Roman was a Hollywood veteran, having appeared in numerous films in the 1940s and 50s, including Stage Door Canteen and Champion, alongside Kirk Douglas. Though she was of Lithuanian descent, Roman embraced the public perception that she was an Italian actress. She was traveling with her 3-year-old son, Richard Roman Hall, also known as Dickie. One of Roman's companions on the Doria's final crossing was fellow passenger Betsy Drake, married at the time to actor Cary Grant. Ruth Roman was also traveling with 35 pairs of shoes. These next photographs were taken from a brochure from the Doria's sister ship, the Cristoforo Colombo, or so it seems. The brochure is actually from the Andrea Doria, and after that ship's tragic loss, these items were collected and heavily retouched to remove all traces and mention of the Doria's existence. These changes are evident by the use of silver overlays to obliterate the Doria's name, replacing it with the Colombos. The Doria was the first ship to have 3 outdoor swimming pools, one for each class of passenger. There's one of the swimming pools, and on this life preserver here, you can see the name of the Cristoforo Colombo, which has covered the Andrea Doria's name. Again, a view of the 3 swimming pools. This brochure, by the way, is on the table if you'd like to take a look at it afterwards. And that's the cover. Again, these silver overlays would have referenced the Andrea Doria. The Doria had 31 public rooms, all adorned with original artwork. Each of the 3 classes aboard ship, first, cabin, and tourist, had its own bar, library, gymnasium, shops, ballrooms, and theaters. The crowning glory of these spaces was the Belvedere Observation Lounge directly below the bridge, which served first class as its formal dancing venue. The first class lounge, shown here, I'm sorry, we're one ahead of where we should be. I'm sorry. There we are. My fault. Let's see. Featured an 8-panel, 1,600 square foot mural. The children's dining room and adjacent playroom displayed circus animals cavorting over its walls. 2 1,000-pound ceramic panels were displayed in a lounge on the promenade deck, and the Catholic chapel held ancient paintings by Renaissance masters depicting the 12 stations of the cross and a magnificent silver chalice and candlesticks. Each passenger class had its own china pattern. In first class, Italy's premier porcelain maker, Richard Ginori, offered a red and gold pattern. In cabin class, the service was trimmed in blue and gold. There was also the zodiac room, which I have mentioned, created to look like a planetarium with overhead stars and zodiac signs. There was also a stateroom named for Rita Hayworth. Anybody remember her? Oh, good. Sometimes you don't. Whose walls were covered in quilted satin. The beds were covered with satin spreads, and the windows were adorned with satin drapes, all to mimic the actress's famously seductive pose in a satin gown for Life magazine. Now, I have a friend who's an antiquarian who is also well aware of my interest in the Andrea Doria. He contacted me a few months ago and told me there was a family in Ohio that I really should speak to. He told them about me, and they were anxious to receive my call. I called. The family had 3 items pertaining to the Andrea Doria that they wanted to go to someone who had an interest in the ship and who would keep their secret. I was intrigued, to say the least. The items were the pieces of china that you see here on this table to my right. A dessert plate, an espresso cup, and a saucer. As indicated by the color of their trim, they were used in the cabin class dining room aboard ship. But how did this family acquire these incredibly rare items? That's the secret. I think you've already figured it out. And the source of this china's acquisition is of such importance to the family that a condition of transferring this china to me is that I never reveal their identity. Here's what happened. The night of the collision was the Doria's last night at sea before arriving in New York. Most of the passengers spent the time packing their bags for debarkation the next morning. After dinner, a member of this family, who was not living in Ohio at the time, carefully wrapped these pieces of china, borrowed from the dining room, in clothing and put them in a suitcase. In the days following the loss of the Andrea Doria, the U.S. Navy assembled dive teams to explore the wreck and bring to the surface anything they could find of value, including the ship's safe, and any personal items that could be returned to passengers, especially luggage. And so the suitcase containing the borrowed china was retrieved and returned to the family. Its contents were wet, but miraculously undamaged. The family retained ownership of this china for 60 years, not wanting to keep it, but not wanting to part with it, and risk exposure as petty thieves. So they held on to it, until my friend the antiques dealer put the two of us together. One other condition the family has for my sharing these rare objects with you, other than anonymity, is that they want to express their profound gratitude to the United States Navy divers who risked their lives to recover these and so many other objects of value to their owners, or in this case, their borrowers. These are other pictures of the interior of the Andrea Doria, staterooms above and below. We would not have a story to tell were it not for this ship. This is the MS Stockholm, the fourth flagship of the Swedish-American line to carry that name. Built in 1946 in Gothenburg, Sweden, the Stockholm entered service in January of 1948. The ship is 525 feet long and weighs 12,165 tons. In 1956, she is the smallest transatlantic passenger liner. And if you remember what I was telling you about the Symphony of the Seas, this ship is only 1/4 of the size of the Symphony. The Stockholm left New York, bound for its home port of Gothenburg, on Wednesday morning, July 25th, 1956. She carried 534 passengers and a crew of 208. Now there are two details I want you to take note of. First, like the Andrea Doria, the Stockholm is gracefully and beautifully built. At that time, it was compared to a large and luxurious yacht, more than to any other ocean liner. The second item of note is the bow of this great ship. Notice its sharp and rakish angle. That's because the Stockholm's home port of Gothenburg was often threatened with floating ice, and so the Stockholm's bow was specially reinforced and strengthened to act as an icebreaker. What you cannot see in this picture is the fact that the bow is serrated, like a steak knife. While its appearance is one of style, the bow of this ship was stronger than that of any other ocean liner of its time, a fact that would be of severe consequence in the summer of 1956. Also, as a nod to the forward portion of the ship's function of design and inherent dangers thereof, no passenger cabins were located forward of the bridge. Only crew's quarters were located in the bow, another fact of consequence. Now, these are some first class and other images of the Stockholm's interior. The first class lounge is on the left. The smoking room for second class is on the right. And a first class stateroom. This is the stern of the Stockholm. Again, note its streamlined, yacht-like appearance. This is the bridge of the Stockholm. The ship's radar is seen on the extreme right in the top photograph, way over here, and in greater detail in the photograph below. This is the bridge of the Andrea Doria. The plotting devices for its radar are located in the top drawer of the cabinet in the lower photograph. From the moment she first slid into the sea at her christening to the moment she slipped beneath the surface of the Atlantic, the Andrea Doria was commanded by Piero Calamai. He was a decorated Italian naval officer in both World War I and World War II. He commanded 27 ships before taking the bridge of the Doria. A quiet man, Calamai was known throughout the seafaring community for his soft-spoken, calm composure, and gentlemanly demeanor. While he disliked the social aspects of being a ship's captain, he fulfilled these obligations effortlessly and was held in high esteem by passengers and crew alike. The Andrea Doria's crossing in July 1956 was to be the 58-year-old captain's last with his beloved ship. After their 3 years together, he was to take command of the Doria's sister ship, the Cristoforo Colombo, upon their return to Genoa. This is a photograph taken of Captain Calamai on the Andrea Doria's maiden voyage in January 1953. There were 3 officers on the bridge of the Andrea Doria at the time of the collision, and here they are. Second Officer Curzio Francini is on the left, Captain Calamai is in the center, seated, and Third Officer Eugenio Giannini is on the right. In command of the Stockholm at the time it collided with the Andrea Doria was Captain Henry Gunnar Nordenson, age 63, a native of Quincy, Massachusetts. Captain Nordenson had at one time or another commanded every ship in the Swedish-American line. He was a strict disciplinarian who discouraged casual conversation among himself and his officers and crew. You can probably tell that by looking at him. Captain Nordenson was asleep in his cabin when the Stockholm struck the Andrea Doria, only reaching the bridge during the aftermath of the collision. Captain Nordenson continued to command the Stockholm following the tragedy, though he retired from the sea shortly after the Andrea Doria disaster. He suffered a stroke soon after the investigations following the collision and passed away in 1959. This is the man who was on the bridge, running the Stockholm that fateful night. He is 26-year-old Third Officer Johan Ernst Bogislaus August Karstens Johansson. Does the secretary have that? Whom we will call Karstens from now on. His relative inexperience at the helm and with the ship's radar may have worsened or caused the disaster. This is a photograph of Captain Nordenson and Third Officer Karstens, taken during one of the many inquests, inquiries, hearings, and trials following the loss of the Andrea Doria. He staunchly defended Karstens throughout the inquiries. One can only imagine how Captain Nordenson felt about this newfound attention. Now here's something that bears remembering. I know it does for me. If you're looking down at the top of a ship from above, with the bow at the top and the stern at the bottom, the left side of the ship is called port, and the right side is called starboard. The diagram on the left is how the Stockholm interpreted the situation just before the collision. The diagram on the right is the Andrea Doria's version. Note especially where each ship thought it was before any turns were made. The Stockholm thought it would pass the Doria to port. The Doria thought it would pass the Stockholm to starboard. Had neither ship made any turns whatsoever, they likely would have collided head-on in the dense fog, which, ironically, would have resulted in far less damage to either vessel. At sea, if collisions could not be avoided, the head-on variety was preferred. Ships' sides were far more vulnerable than their bows. You are now Third Officer Karstens, on the bridge and in control of the Stockholm at 11 p.m. on Wednesday, July 25th, 1956. You've just come on duty relieving your captain who is retired for the night. The lookout reports lights ahead. Taking binoculars in hand, you determine the approaching ship to be heading toward the Stockholm off your port side, based on the position of its lights. You barely see 2 white lights, one each on the bow and stern of the stranger, the stronger of which, its forward light, is slightly to the left, which you assume means that ship is coming toward your port side. You judge the ship to be nearly 5 miles away, according to your reading of the radar. Your reading of the radar, however, is incorrect in 2 respects. You are not 5 miles from this vessel as you interpret the screen. You are only 2 miles away. And you are actually approaching the oncoming vessel head-on, and slightly to its starboard side. You also calculate that the approaching ship is traveling at half the speed that it actually is. By your reckoning at the angle and presumed speed the ship is coming at you, you determine that the stranger will pass you on your port side at a distance of about 0.6 of a mile. You want to widen that margin of safety, so you order a turn to starboard of 20 degrees. After the turn, you order a return of the wheel to center. Your 2 ships, you believe, will now pass each other at a distance of at least a mile apart, again assuming a 5-mile separation. You are actually less than a mile away from the other ship at this point. What you don't notice or realize is that the other ship is sailing in dense fog, and you are not. Your sky is clear and moonlit. It does not occur to you that the intensity of the other ship's bow and stern lights are affected by fog, not by distance or direction. You cannot see the other ship's starboard light, which is colored green, coming toward you. All you see is its port light, colored red. You assume that because you cannot see the other ship's green starboard light, that the ship will pass you port to port. Seconds later, you look through the binoculars again and see the stranger's lights have changed positions. That ship is now coming out of a fog bank you didn't even know was there. The white lights on the other ship's bow and stern are now almost perfectly aligned, and the green starboard light is on your left. The red port light is on your right. They are both glowing with equal intensity. This means the other ship is now heading straight for you. You have no idea the size of the ship, all you can see are its lights, and you do not comprehend that it's bigger than you are by half. You cannot believe what you are seeing, but you know that a calamity is looming. You grab the levers of the engine room telegraph and slam them hard to full speed astern. You then shout an order to the helmsman to turn the ship hard to starboard. You do not know that the oncoming vessel is making a sharp and rapid turn to its port side to avoid you, and that both of you are unwittingly turning your ships into the path of each other. Far below decks in the Stockholm's engine room, you are now second engineer Justra Svensson, and you can't believe what you're being asked to do. In order to propel a ship full speed into reverse, you first have to stop it, and its engines dead in the water, then restart the engines and shift them into reverse. Stopping the Stockholm, which was moving at nearly full speed, and getting it back up would take more than 2 miles of ocean. What you don't know is that the pride of the Italian line, and of Italy itself, is less than 400 yards away, bearing down at full speed, desperately trying to avoid you. You are now Second Officer Curzio Francini on the bridge of the Andrea Doria. Your reading of the radar tells you a vessel is approaching the Doria at a distance of about 5 miles. You presume the strange ship is a small fishing boat, late returning to Nantucket. You reason that your two vessels will pass each other starboard to starboard about a mile apart. What you don't know is that your reading of the radar and your counterpart's reading of the radar on the approaching ship are exactly opposite. You're anticipating a starboard to starboard passing, and he's expecting a port to port encounter. One of you is making a fatal mistake. Both of you miscalculate the distance between you by 3 miles, and you both underestimate the speed of the other vessel. At 11:05 p.m., you are now Captain Calamai. You're also on the Doria's bridge this late at night because of the threatening fog. You have ordered the watertight doors below decks closed as a precaution, without having any idea how many lives this would save within just a few hours. Your reading of the radar concurs with Officer Francini's and indicates the oncoming vessel is approaching you at 14 degrees to starboard. You command the helmsman to turn 4 degrees to port for good measure. The other ship is now about 3.5 miles away by your reckoning. In reality, it's less than 2 miles away. And you see on the radar that it's much bigger than a fishing boat. You are now Third Officer Eugenio Giannini. You step out onto the Doria's starboard wing bridge with your binoculars. To your horror, you discover 2 things. 1, the approaching ship is traveling much faster than you presumed it was. It's only about a mile away now. And 2, its running lights tell you that it's turning towards starboard, not port, and coming straight at you. You can't imagine why. You don't take the time to walk back into the bridge to share your observations. Instead, you shout them to the captain from where you stand. As Captain Calamai, you order the Doria to turn hard to port. Your second officer moves to the telegraph handles, anticipating an order to stop the ship. You tell him not to touch the levers, saying you need all the speed the ship has in order to run faster and outrun the intruder. Besides, there is no time to stop anyway. Your ship makes the turn and continues along at full speed. The oncoming vessel is 400 yards away, and bearing down on you also at full speed. Your gamble to turn sharply to port proves fatal. Had you stayed on course, you would have passed to port and astern of the other ship without incident. You're now on the bridge of the Stockholm. It's nearly 10 minutes past 11. You cannot believe what you are seeing. You stare in silence. You cannot move. Out of the mist from your port side comes a gleaming black and white Leviathan, towering above you. The ship is twice the size of yours and firmly in command of the sea, moving swiftly and stately across your path. You can see the name on the bow in gold lettering, Andrea Doria, as it crosses before you. Your recognition is instant. You see the lights from her high decks and portholes streaming out onto the water and onto the bow of your ship. As it is warm and most of those portholes are open, you can hear the strains of the other ship's orchestra performing its final selection of the evening, Arrivederci Roma, in its ballroom. That ship is nearly 700 feet long and only about a quarter of it has passed you. You know you cannot avoid ramming it broadside with your knife-like bow. You brace yourself for the inevitable. You are Third Officer Karstens. You are standing outside on the port side wing bridge of the Stockholm, gripping the railing for dear life. In just moments, you know that the deadly weapon that is the bow of your ship will slice the Gloria of Genoa in half, pulverizing the Stockholm in the process and sending both of your beautiful ships and the lives they carry to the bottom of the Atlantic in minutes. May God have mercy and make the ending swift. You are now on the bridge of the Andrea Doria. Your maneuvering and speed cannot save you. Incredibly, lights are coming directly at you from your starboard side. You see them well before you see the ship that they belong to. The fog suddenly clears. Then you see that shimmering white bow aimed directly at you like a sword. You abandon the ship's controls and reach instinctively for your life jackets and for the crucifixes hanging on chains beneath your shirts. You begin to pray, loudly and together. The white intruder, you still don't know her name, is aimed right at you and is coming fast. You abandon the helm and scramble for the port side of the bridge, knowing what comes next. And it does. On the Stockholm, it's the ship's first night at sea out of New York. Passengers are lingering in the bars and public rooms, dancing in the lounge and beginning to think about turning in. Some stroll the decks, watching the moonlight shimmer on the calm sea. Some may have taken note that the engines had stopped. One passenger lies awake in her bed, however. She is returning to see family in her native Finland, and she has not been aboard a ship in 44 years. The last time she was when she left the RMS Carpathia in New York in 1912, having been rescued by that vessel from a lifeboat in the North Atlantic in the aftermath of the Titanic disaster. On the Andrea Doria, it's the ship's last night at sea. Many passengers have gone to bed early after packing their luggage and retrieving their valuables from the ship's safe, as the ship is due to dock at 8 o'clock the next morning in New York. Stewards have set the tables in all 3 dining saloons for an early breakfast. China, glassware, and silver all in its proper place. Some night owls are in the ship's theater watching the final scenes of a movie. Others have one last drink at one of the Doria's 3 bars, while still others glide through one last waltz in the Belvedere Lounge, dressed in evening gowns and dinner jackets. Mink stoles are draped over the backs of chairs, more for effect than for warmth. The Stockholm slams into the Andrea Doria, ramming the ship 4 decks below the bridge and 1 deck below its Belvedere Lounge ballroom on its starboard side. The Stockholm enters the Italian liner to a depth of 30 feet, destroying everything and everyone in its path. The powerful white Leviathan slices into 5 passenger decks, the Doria's 50-car parking garage, its generator room, which cuts the Doria's electrical supply, and its starboard fuel tanks. The Swedish liner is then dragged along by the still advancing Doria for a distance of 100 feet before it breaks 3 and scrapes along the Doria's starboard side, sending a shower of sparks high into the night sky. The sound of these colliding vessels is both horrendous and deafening. The Stockholm finally shudders to a stop as its anchors, which are set free in the collision, plunge to the bottom, holding the ship in place. The Doria stalls as its fuel lines are severed in the crash. Its forward motion is now halted by a flood of seawater filling its midsection. Silence follows, punctuated by the cries of the injured and the dying. On both ships, everything and everyone is violently thrown to the floor. Passengers, crew, objects, glassware, liquor bottles, china, cutlery, furniture. Anything that is not bolted down is airborne and becomes a deadly missile. Does anybody know what the single most harmful thing was flying through the air at that moment? Glass ashtrays. They were heavy and they flew very well. It's important to remember that when the collision occurred, only a handful of people knew the cause. If you were on the bridge of either ship or you happened to be strolling on the deck of the Doria or the Stockholm and witnessed the disaster for yourself, you had no idea what happened. Survivors later identified several causes that went through their minds in that instant, including the explosion of an engine, running aground, being struck by a Russian torpedo, or hitting an iceberg. The notion of being rammed by another passenger liner did not occur to anyone. One man who had the fortune or misfortune of walking along the starboard side promenade deck of the Andrea Doria at the moment of impact later recounted his disbelief when the Stockholm came into view and didn't stop. It looked like a great white shark, its sharp nose lunging at us for the kill, he said, adding, "The strike sounded like 1,000 dump trucks, all dumping a load of small stones all at once. And it felt like you were on a seesaw, and the other person suddenly got off while you were high in the air." In the instant the two ships collided, 56 people were brutally killed. 46 passengers and 5 crew members on the Doria, and 5 crew members asleep in the Stockholm's bow. All of their dismembered bodies are swept out to sea and are never recovered. The Doria was designed to remain afloat and discharge all of its lifeboats if it sustained a list of 15 degrees or less. In the moments after the collision, it heeled to starboard 20 degrees, meaning it would be impossible to lower any lifeboats on its port side. The reason for the Doria's excessive list, which held at 20 degrees due to Captain Calamai's order to shut the watertight doors, was because the Stockholm penetrated the Doria's hull at precisely the site of the ship's starboard fuel tanks, which were nearly empty due to it being the end of a voyage. Lying directly opposite these tanks were the portside fuel tanks, which were also approaching empty. Once the starboard side tanks were opened to and rapidly filled by the sea, the port tanks acted as giant balloons, lifting and tilting the entire ship to starboard faster and to a greater degree than had they been fueled by fuel. It was the Italian line's recommended practice that once fuel tanks were emptied at sea, they were to be filled with seawater to retain stability. Most captains, including Captain Calamai, ignored this directive, as it was extremely costly to have the seawater flushed out and the tanks purified once in port so they could again take on fuel. Almost immediately, the Andrea Doria listed to starboard. Other than the battery-powered emergency lighting on the ship's superstructure, the ship had lost power. Having adjusted to the initial impact, passengers and crew now had to make their way to their lifeboat stations in total darkness on sloping decks. Thankfully, there had been lifeboat drills throughout the voyage. Passengers whose assigned lifeboats were on the Doria's port side soon discovered these boats were useless and began the perilous journey to the starboard side of the ship. Normally, lifeboats on the starboard side would have been accessed by passengers stepping into them through the large windows on the promenade deck. However, due to the ship's list, this was impossible. The boats were instead lowered to the water first, then the passengers climbed down ladders or rode down in bosun's chairs to the lifeboats below directly from the boat deck, which was a very harrowing experience. On the bridge, Captain Calamai and his officers, by some miracle still alive, hoped for the best and planned for the worst. At best, all the damage that could be done to their ship had been done. If the watertight doors held, there would be time to evacuate the passengers and perhaps save the ship from sinking by having it towed to port. It was also on the minds that the Lusitania had sunk in 18 minutes with similar damage, and the Titanic, also breached on her starboard side, was gone in a little more than 2 hours. With no time to waste, Captain Calamai was mindful of the fact that he lost the use of half his lifeboats, and like the Titanic, he now did not have enough remaining to save everyone. But unlike the Titanic, several ships were now rushing to the Doria's rescue, while immediate salvation came from an unlikely source, the Stockholm. Captain Calamai delays his order to abandon ship until the rescuers are on the scene so as not to panic the passengers. This photograph was taken by a passenger from another rescue vessel soon to arrive, the Ile de France. It is the only picture we have of the Andrea Doria in darkness. That was the previous shot, I'm sorry. This is where the word desperate comes in. Imagine you've been asleep on the Doria's lower decks. You're jolted awake and now have to find your way up on deck through tilting, black passageways, sloshing through cold seawater up to your knees, knowing you could sink in a matter of minutes, but not knowing why. This was the situation at dawn, again as photographed from the Ile de France. You can see 2 lifeboats shuttling the passengers to the French liner as the Andrea Doria bravely holds her own in the distance. The French line's Ile de France was 40 miles east of the site of the collision en route from New York to Europe when it heard the Doria's radio distress signal and turned around to help. The Ile de France was one of the largest and most luxurious ocean liners of the time and arrived at the Doria's position in less than 2 hours. The master of the ship, Baron Raoul de Baudien, played his vessel like a fine musical instrument. He powered his huge liner at full speed to within a mile of the Doria, then cut his engines completely so the ship glided to a halt some 400 feet off the stricken liner's bow. He then issued an order that stirred the spirits of hundreds of Doria passengers who'd been stranded for 2.5 hours on their tilting ship. "Light up our name, the funnels, the decks," he said. "Light up all the staterooms, public rooms, and passageways. Light up everything, quickly. Then get all of our lifeboats in the water, now." The sight of this massive, gorgeous symbol of nautical elegance and dominance, bathed in light from bow to stern, sitting so close by, brought hope to those sorely in need of it. In bringing his ship to the Doria's rescue, he'd also managed to position it so that it had absorbed the effects of approaching waves to ease the lifeboat's mission. These photographs are some of the interiors of the Ile de France to give you an idea of how truly grand a ship this was. Many of the fittings and furnishings were from another French line masterpiece, the Normandy, after it was converted into a troop carrier during World War II. The Ile succeeded the Normandy as the pinnacle of Art Deco excellence on the high seas, and you can see why. This is the stern of the Ile de France as it arrived in New York with survivors of the Andrea Doria's collision with the Stockholm. In all, the Ile saved 753 of the Doria's 1,706 passengers and crew. The Stockholm rescued 572. Some of the remaining survivors were taken aboard by the Cape Ann, a freighter out of Nantucket, which was first to arrive on the scene after the collision. Others were rescued by the freighters Robert E. Hopkins and the private William H. Thomas. The Ile de France remained in service until 1959 when it was sold to a Japanese company for scrap. Before it was dismantled, however, it suffered a rather ignominious fate. It was used as a set piece in the movie The Last Voyage, where it was partially sunk, explosive devices were detonated in its interior, and its forward funnel was sent crashing onto the bridge. The French line was so appalled that they sued the film company, and won, to change the colors of the ship and to prohibit the use of the name Ile de France in the movie. The ship became the SS Clarendon for purposes of filming. And don't bother watching the movie, it's terrible. The young lady in the hospital bed is known as the Miracle Girl, and for good reason. She is Linda Morgan, a 14-year-old Andrea Doria passenger who is traveling back to America with her mother, stepfather, and sister. The man with the mustache, shown in the photograph, is her father, radio newsman Edward Morgan. On the night of the disaster, Linda and her sister went to bed early. Linda and her family were to be the guests of Captain Calamai at his table during the ship's last dinner, and Linda eagerly anticipated getting his autograph, which was a popular hobby of the day. The captain remained on the bridge throughout dinner due to the presence of fog, however, and Linda and her sister went to bed early, disappointed at having missed their opportunity. She would try again in the morning at breakfast. Linda went to sleep in the cabin she shared with her sister. She woke up under a starry sky, unable to move her right arm or her legs. She gazed up into the eyes of Bernardo Polanco Garcia, who was standing over her. He's still standing over her. He was confronting her in Spanish, a language Linda knew well. "Where is my mother?" she asked. "On the Andrea Doria," came the man's reply. "So where am I?" she wanted to know. Now she was thoroughly confused. "On the Stockholm." Garcia, a member of the Stockholm's crew, told her that. The story of how she got there is incredible. When the Stockholm collided with the Andrea Doria, the Swedish ship's bow penetrated the Italian liner directly in line with Linda Morgan's stateroom. The Stockholm's forward deck pierced the Doria so that it was perfectly level with the floor in Linda's cabin. Linda's bed, which was closest to the exterior of the ship, was scooped up by the Stockholm, which then carried it from the Doria's floor onto the remaining foredeck of the Stockholm, then with it out through the wound in the Doria's side. Linda and her bed were now on the Stockholm, perched just inches away from the liner's destroyed bow, precariously above the sea below. On the bed next to her was the autograph book she'd hoped Captain Calamai would sign. Linda had gone to sleep on one ship and woke up on another. She was alive, but she'd broken her right arm and both of her legs. Her mother, though badly injured, survived the disaster, but her sister, sleeping right next to her on the Doria, perished, along with her stepfather in the adjoining cabin. This is another photograph of Linda Morgan and Bernabé Garcia, the man who found her on the Stockholm's damaged bow. I believe he's quite interested in her. And this is Linda Morgan today. She has worked as a librarian, an editor, and a publisher, and she still treasures the autograph book she had aboard the Andrea Doria. And yes, Captain Calamai did eventually sign it when he visited her in the hospital during her recuperation. So did the Stockholm's Captain Nordenson and Third Officer Karstens. And of course, Seaman Garcia also penned his signature. This is Richardson Dilworth and his wife Anne, passengers on the Andrea Doria. Mr. Dilworth was the highest-ranking American on board at the time of the collision, as he was the mayor of Philadelphia. Now I ask you, could there be any better name for the mayor of Philadelphia than Richardson Dilworth? Mrs. Dilworth suffered a blackened eye as she fell on the Doria's sloping main deck during the couple's evacuation from the ship. Like many others on board both ships, Anne Dilworth thought they had struck an iceberg, perhaps forgetting that they were 40 miles south of Nantucket on a warm July evening. A Night to Remember about the Titanic's sinking was the most popular book of the day. The book had rekindled an interest in the doomed liner and spawned several movies which were popular in the mid-1950s. This is actress Ruth Roman reunited with her son Dickie in New York. Dickie had been rescued by the Stockholm unbeknownst to his mother, while Ms. Roman was taken aboard the Ile-de-France. She had not seen him since she put him in bed in the cabin next to hers on the Doria. A crew member had spirited Dickie to safety before his mother could reach him. When the sun rose on the morning of July 26, by some miracle and against all odds, the Andrea Doria remained afloat. Also, by some great miracle, all surviving passengers, crew, and pets had been rescued, including one large Great Dane who was not happy and who was extremely uncooperative. I just want to point out, this is the point of impact right here. One blemish on the rescue operation was that several members of the Doria's crew, mainly chambermaids and dining room stewards, left the liner ahead of passengers. Most of the crew, however, and all of the Doria's officers remained aboard until all passengers had been evacuated. The Doria's officers waited until everyone else had left the ship, then they climbed down a ladder into a Coast Guard lifeboat. Captain Calamai remained on board. "You may go, I am staying," he told them. Second Officer Francini motioned for him to join them, but he refused. Francini climbed back up the ladder and implored the captain to leave. Calamai insisted that he would wait for the tugboats to come and tow his ship, or he would go down with it, but he would not leave. Francini called over the side and beckoned the officers in the lifeboat to come back aboard the Doria. Calamai protested, and Francini told him that if he would not leave, they would come back and stay with him. Calamai relented and followed Francini down the ladder, past the gaping hole in his beautiful ship. Captain Calamai was the last man to leave the Andrea Doria, or so he thought. Robert Lee Hudson, an American sailor under heavy sedation in his cabin to ease the pain of injuries he had suffered in an accident before he boarded the Doria in Genoa, staggered out on deck as the lifeboat carrying the officers pulled away. Dazed, confused, and heavily medicated, and unable to respond when crewmen rounded up all the passengers, he'd been trying to find his way to daylight for hours. The crew in another lifeboat nearby saw him and directed him to safety down the same ladder the Doria's officers had just used. Along with Linda Morgan, Hudson's survival is also a miracle. Now, this is a remarkable picture, taken from a Coast Guard vessel of the stricken Andrea Doria on the left and the Ile-de-France, just before the latter's departure from New York. Captain Baudien of the Ile left the scene as dramatically as he had arrived upon it. In tribute, he was now flying both the French and Italian flags aboard the Ile and ordered them to half-staff. He then circled his liner around the Andrea Doria 3 times, sounding the ship's whistle as a final tribute. The Coast Guard ship in the foreground is the USS Hornbeam, and the lifeboat you see on its starboard side is delivering Captain Calamai and the officers of the Andrea Doria. This photograph was taken by Harry Trask, whom we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Once the Italian officers were aboard the Hornbeam, hope began to rise. The Doria was still afloat, badly damaged to be sure, but afloat. If it were going to sink, they reasoned, it would be gone by now. The fact that it was holding on some 10 hours after the collision was a miracle. Telegrams and radio messages began in earnest. Plans were made to have the Coast Guard ships and tugboats from Boston and New York tow the Andrea Doria 23 miles to the south, to a point where the ocean was only 30 feet deep. Normally avoided by ships of all sizes at all costs, this was now the desired destination for the Pride of Italy. The reasoning was that once the ship was grounded, it would not sink, and efforts could be made to retrieve the dead. Messages also fluttered between the Hornbeam and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and the Italian consulates in both cities, to dispatch experts and conservators to the stricken liner to salvage whatever works of art they could remove. As the Andrea Doria was being relieved of its precious cargo, it could also be roughly repaired enough to be towed to New York and be overhauled. Now, when we did this program for the Auburn Historical Society, a man came up to me afterward and said he was serving in the Navy in Boston when the collision occurred. He described being mustered to a meeting in the early morning hours of July 26. The sailors were briefed on the Andrea Doria's situation and of the plans to reboard the ship and retrieve human remains and works of art in that order. The men were shown pictures of the artwork that they were most desired and could easily be removed. Small paintings, objects, and statuary, and many of the priceless ancient relics in the Doria's chapel. No one in that room had any way of knowing that the chapel had already been destroyed by the Stockholm. The sailors were given maps of the ship's location, and they were carefully instructed on how to remove and safeguard the treasures. When the briefing ended, they gathered around the large deck plan of the Doria that had been hastily tacked to the wall to familiarize themselves with the shortest route to their destinations. The men never left port, however, as word soon came that the Pride of Italy had slipped beneath the waves. Those were the plans, but the Andrea Doria had other ideas. What her champions on land and sea did not know was that the watertight doors, struggling for hours to hold back a relentless sea, were beginning to fail. They were never intended to serve as bulkheads. Little by little, water was rising into passageways, stairwells, staterooms, and open portholes, creeping ever higher, deck by deck, like water overfilling an ice cube tray. It was only a matter of time now. Mortally wounded and tired of fighting, the Andrea Doria decided that her time had come. It was time to say goodbye. Her end was at hand, and she would leave with as much dignity as she could muster. She would share her final moments with an unlikely companion, a young photographer from Cohasset, Massachusetts. I worked with a man by the name of Jim Sullivan at the Barry Library for many, many years. Jim grew up in Cohasset and frequently returned there to visit family and friends. He knew of my interest in the Andrea Doria and suggested I meet a high school classmate and neighbor of his by the name of Harry Trask. Harry grew up and still lived with his wife and 7 children in the house across the street from the Sullivans in Cohasset. He didn't tell me why I should meet Harry, but assured me I'd value the experience. So one weekend I accompanied Jim to the South Shore, and we walked across the street from Jim's mother's house to see Harry. We were led into the kitchen and seated at the table. "Lester's interested in the Andrea Doria," Jim said. "I told him he should meet you." Harry turned to me and asked, "Did Jim tell you why?" I said no, he hadn't. Harry smiled and told me his story. In the summer of 1956, Harry Trask was a 28-year-old photographer for the now-defunct Boston Traveler newspaper. He was called at home in Cohasset in the middle of the night on July 25th by his editor, who told him the Andrea Doria had collided with another ship and was sinking south of Nantucket. He was to get on a plane and get out there as soon as he could and take pictures of the scene. His job depended on it. Harry grabbed his camera bag and drove to the airport in Revere, where he engaged a pilot and rented a Piper Cherokee, which would take him to Nantucket. But to his disappointment, that's as far as the plane would go. Harry was stuck on Nantucket at 4 in the morning, while all of the major news outlets in the country all had reporters and camera crews in the air, bearing down on the Andrea Doria. He didn't know what to do. He caught a small break when a Coast Guard evacuation helicopter started arriving on the island with injured survivors from the disaster, and he photographed them. But that wasn't what he'd been assigned to do. Trask tried getting a ride to the scene on a Coast Guard vessel, helicopter or ship, but he was denied. The Coast Guard crewman took pity on him and made a few phone calls on Harry's behalf to pilots of private planes who owed him favors. Finally, Harry's luck changed. The Coast Guardsmen found a pilot on Martha's Vineyard who would come to Nantucket and take Harry out to the Andrea Doria. But time was slipping by. By the time Harry got on the plane for his ride to the Doria, it was already 9:30 in the morning of July 26. All of the other news reporters, photographers, and cameramen were already flying back to Boston and New York with their reports and footage. The Boston Traveler was about to be scooped, and scooped but good. And that was not going to be good for Harry or his job. Harry got on the plane anyway, but really didn't want to for 2 reasons. One, the aforementioned pointlessness of his mission. The ship would surely have sunk by the time he got there, if it hadn't already. And 2, Harry was prone to violent air sickness. He was now on a small plane, dashing over the waves, regretting every minute of it. He remembered he'd left his Dramamine at home. They were in a Beechcraft Bonanza, a very small plane not known for its spaciousness, especially when you're airsick, of husky build, and trying to manipulate your large press camera. To make matters worse, the plane had low wings, not overhead ones like Cessna's had, meaning Harry and the pilot had to creatively move themselves and the plane around to get pictures and try to avoid his subject being blocked out by the plane's wing. All that bouncing and maneuvering didn't help Harry's air sickness one bit. Part of him was grateful he'd left home in such a hurry. He'd had no time to eat. When the Andrea Doria came into view, both the pilot and Harry were amazed that it was still afloat. They began circling the crippled liner, and Harry taking pictures from every angle. Then he noticed something. Each time the plane came around the ship, the Doria's funnel seemed to be getting closer to the water. Her final tortured farewell was coming to an end. The small plane circling the Doria again and again, and Harry furiously taking pictures and making note of the time. At 10 a.m., the ship's starboard rail slipped under the water, and the port side propeller came into view. At 10:01, water began to cascade inside the Doria's streamlined funnel, painted in Italy's colors of red, white, and green. The Doria's 3 swimming pools now filled with seawater. By 10:04, the Doria's entire starboard side was underwater, and waves were licking over the bow. Over the drone of the airplane's engine, Harry Trask could now hear loud, heavy groans and a steady roar coming from the doomed ship, what he called her sighs of death. The trapped air within the hull was now being replaced by the ocean so quickly that a huge swell of water and air now rushed toward the stern. The Doria's bow went completely under, and the portside lifeboats, still held firmly in place, were now violently torn from their davits and splintered to pieces by the onrushing sea. The pressure of the air escaping from the hull blew out all of the portholes on the port side, sending geysers of water dramatically into the air. Debris from the decks and the shattered lifeboats now slid into the sea. Harry felt tears come to his eyes as he tried to focus his camera on the Doria's last moments. I was witnessing the death of a grand ship, and it was brutal, painful, and heartbreaking, he said. And in those moments she seemed so helpless, so human, and yet so noble. The ship capsized, and now both of her propellers and her bronze rudder were glistening in the sun. Her bow had plunged completely into the sea and dropped to rest on the seabed as her stern rose high into the air. The legends Andrea Doria and Genoa were now visible on the gleaming black hull. Suspended by the air that remained inside her, the Doria froze in that position for 3 or 4 minutes, then slowly and certainly descended into the sea, coming to rest on her wounded starboard side in the smooth sand some 225 feet below. The Andrea Doria's suffering was over. By 3:15 that afternoon, the Hornbeam had anchored a yellow 50-gallon drum over her resting place. That evening, Pope Pius XII celebrated Mass at his summer residence in honor of those who perished. The Prime Minister of Italy declared a period of national mourning, not just for the passengers, but for the Andrea Doria herself. And Harry Trask was with her at the end, and here are his pictures. This is the starboard side, and you can see that the efforts by the pumps are probably not going to do much good. The starboard side rail goes underwater, and now the bow is going underwater. The water has begun to flow into the funnel. The bow is gone. The lifeboats are being torn from the port side of the ship very violently. The last images, the first time the propellers and the rudder had been exposed to air since the ship had been christened. And now it is gone. Harry Trask was the only still photographer present when the Andrea Doria sank. Despite being late to arrive and seriously sick to his stomach, those factors were compensated by for the fact that his newspaper had the most dramatic visual account of the entire ordeal. And Harry's story does not end there. In 1957, Harry Trask and the Boston Traveler were awarded the Pulitzer Prize for photojournalism for his work that July day off the coast of Nantucket. When Harry had finished telling his story, he rose from his kitchen table and went to the broom closet by the refrigerator. He opened it, and there was this picture, thumbtacked to the inside of the door. He pulled out the tacks, rolled the picture up, and handed it to me. He told me it was the picture that won him the Pulitzer, and it was the very one displayed at the dinner when he accepted the award. "My kids don't care about this stuff," he said, "so I want you to have it." I had it framed, and I have had it treasured ever since. Kept in touch with Harry and saw him many times in the following years. Sadly, Harry Trask passed away in 2002 at the age of 74. Got a call from his wife, Joan, a few months after Harry died, and she told me they were chartering a boat to spread Harry's ashes at sea over the Andrea Doria, and would I like to go with them? Of course I said yes, and we did. It was an incredible experience to come to rest on a calm sea over the remains of one of the most storied ocean liners of all time, symbolically reuniting the Andrea Doria with the man who was with her at the end. I knew Harry would have appreciated that. The Stockholm, bruised and battered, remained afloat. A skillful manipulation of its watertight doors ensured that it only descended into the ocean to a depth of 3 additional feet. It returned to New York with both its passengers and many Doria survivors under its own power, though it was escorted by the U.S. Coast Guard. The Stockholm did experience an unanticipated consequence of its collision with the Doria, however, when it lost its bow. Its massive anchors and their chains descended into the sea, holding the liner firmly in place until the Coast Guard divers could sever the chains. The lower photograph shows the Stockholm as it arrives in New York, passing the Statue of Liberty. Note how far back the damage goes. From the first picture of the Stockholm that you saw, 1/5 of the ship is now gone. While Harry Trask was on the scene recording the end of the Andrea Doria, he also took some breathtaking pictures of the Stockholm as well. The top photograph was taken by Harry. This is another view of the Stockholm's ruined bow, taken while the ship was in dry dock at Bethlehem Steel for repairs, which cost more than $1 million in Brooklyn, New York. The man in the picture is the Stockholm's second officer, Lars Ennerström. At the moment of the collision, Ennerström was in his cabin reading Walter Lord's A Night to Remember. Baron Raoul de Baudien, charismatic captain of the Ile-de-France, was quickly hailed by the press as the hero of the Doria tragedy. Here he is shown in the center with 2 of his officers reading an optimistic account of the event. In truth, 56 people died at the time of the collision, 51 on the Andrea Doria and 5 on the Stockholm. An additional 5 people died later as a result of their injuries. The good news was 1,663 people were saved. Before the Andrea Doria had descended to her grave, the press was already assigning blame for the tragedy, and they sided heavily with the Stockholm's version of events, making Captain Calamai the villain in the drama. Here he is shown as he arrived in New York, still in his uniform, escorted by a U.S. naval officer on the right and Mario Galassi on the left. Mr. Galassi is Captain Calamai's nephew and served as his uncle's interpreter as the captain spoke little English. It looks like the captain is being taken into custody, but he is not. He spent that night and the next several days in seclusion with his brother's family in New York. The day after the sinking, Harold Kennedy, the senior partner of the Italian Lines law firm, sent a note by messenger to his counterpart, Stockholm attorney Charles Haidt. He wrote, "Dear Charlie, this is a mutual fault case. For the good of the industry, let us settle it now 50-50 and worry about the details some other time. Regards, Harold." 1 hour later, Kennedy had Haidt's reply. "Dear Harold, your offer is refused. You are solely at fault. Regards, Charlie." And so it began and continued. The aftermath of the collision between the Andrea Doria and the Stockholm was both lengthy and contentious. There were inquests, hearings, conferences, trials, lawsuits, and endless meetings, all to assess blame, recover costs, and compensate for loss and suffering. No agreements could be reached. Finally and abruptly, nearly a year later, the courts, precisely in agreement with Harold Kennedy's suggestion, ruled that blame could not be assigned and therefore must be shared equally, and both sides were directed to settle all claims 50-50. As the Andrea Doria disappeared from view, her captain dictated a telegram to the Hornbeam's radio operator to be sent to the Italian Lines offices in New York. It read in its entirety, "Doria sank 10:09. Calamai." Piero Calamai returned to his home in Genoa, never again returning to the sea. He never spoke of the tragedy to anyone but his closest family, often lamenting, "Before I used to love the sea, now I hate it." His daughter described her father as a man who had lost a son. Calamai was particularly hurt by the public perception that he had caused the collision and was responsible for the loss of life that tragic night. The abrupt settlement in the collision litigation had a negative and unintended consequence. It also brought a swift end to the investigation and research into what caused the disaster in the first place. Then in 1971, an independent research team under the aegis of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy re-examined all evidence and testimony in the case, employing new technologies and simulations. They came to a startling conclusion, which is now accepted as fact. Though there was fault on both sides, the single contributing factor causing the collision was the failure of the crew on the Stockholm to properly read and interpret its radar. Captain Calamai was vindicated at last. While he did not shed a tear as he watched his beloved ship founder, he cried when he was told the collision was not his fault. He died less than a year later at the age of 75. His last words were, "Are the passengers all saved?" One feature of the Andrea Doria that most people are unaware of is the fact that the ship had a 50-car garage in the direct path of where the Stockholm collided with her. Cars that were shipped in this manner were lifted by crane to the space, then driven and parked strategically for balance, much like you would in an inner-city parking garage. Among the vehicles the Doria carried on her last voyage were a Rolls-Royce, a Cadillac, a Ferrari, and 2 Mercedes-Benzes. As she was helped into a lifeboat, the owner of the Cadillac demanded to know when her car would be taken from the ship. "And you'd better not scratch it or get it wet," she ordered. "Lady, you're lucky to be alive," came the crewman's reply. Neither of them knew that the Stockholm had already destroyed her car and all of the others. Among these automobiles was a special, one-of-a-kind, fully functioning prototype called the Chrysler Norseman. It was commissioned by Chrysler Corporation and built by Carrozzeria Ghia in Turin, Italy at a cost of $150,000. Big money in 1956. It was a big, fastback, hardtop coupe that was Chrysler's idea car, intended to travel the 1957 show car circuit. It featured a glass rear window that could be retracted up into the roof, hideaway headlamps, a wrapped-around pillarless windshield, minimal trim, and modest fins. A look that was long, low, and clean, a far cry from the styling of the cars on the road in 1956, yet the look would be right at home a decade later. The car's chief revolutionary styling element, however, was its cantilevered roof, supported only at the C pillar and not at the typical A and B pillar locations. While it looked delicate and fragile, Chrysler's engineers claimed the roof could support 8 times the car's weight. Because the Norseman, which was named for the nationality of its designer, Virgil Exner, was to be a show car, its creation and shipment were an industry secret. It left the factory floor in Turin already wrapped in several layers of soft blankets, sealed in a locked shipping crate made especially for it. And in the trunk was a case of fine Italian champagne, a surprise gift from the car's creator to their American counterparts. The Norseman would travel to America aboard the Andrea Doria to be held at a secret location in New York until 1957, when the show season began. No American and only a handful of Italians had ever seen the car, and no one else ever would. The photographs shown here were not made public until the 1970s, after automotive design had changed to evolve past the Norseman's influence. The model on view here, over on that table, was not authorized by Chrysler until 2 years ago. For car buffs, you can see the Norseman's styling influence most apparently on the 1960 Ford Starliner and the 1965 AMC Marlin. Divers to the wreck of the Andrea Doria have periodically checked in on the Norseman and have chronicled its demise. All that remains of it today are vestiges of its tires. The shipping crate and the car it once held have long since dissolved into the sea. Speaking of divers, the first to reach the Doria were from the U.S. Navy, who arrived the day after she sank. This image represents what she looked like then. Over the years, many civilian divers have explored the wreck, retrieving as many artifacts as they could carry, chiefly china and silverware. In 1965, the statue of Admiral Andrea Doria in the ship's first-class lounge was unceremoniously cut off at the ankles and brought to the surface. For a time, it served as an ornament in a garden in New Jersey, and has since been transferred to a museum. A few years later, divers retrieved the Admiral's feet, and he has since been rejoined. This is what the Andrea Doria looked like in 2000. All of its superstructure had disintegrated and fallen away, and it was now a dangerous trap for fishing nets. Known as the Mount Everest of dives, the Doria is an extremely tempting yet equally dangerous challenge for divers due to its depth, swift ocean currents, the tangle of netting, and hazardous conditions. They call the ship a noisy wreck, as it eerily emits various sounds due to continual deterioration and ocean currents moving broken metal around inside the hull. Over the years, 16 men have died exploring the wreck. Either they have become trapped inside the ship or they've died from the bends from ascending too quickly from the depths. Today, all that remains of the Andrea Doria is its hull. The decks, bridge, and everything but its outer shell have degraded and collapsed. In the not-too-distant future, even the Doria's hull itself, already severely cracked, will surrender to the sea and collapse upon itself, leaving little evidence of the once proud national symbol she once was. We know what happened to the Andrea Doria, but whatever became of the Stockholm? Here she is in September 1956, just 2 months after her collision with the Andrea Doria, on her sea trials following the restoration of her bow. Remember what her bow looked like and what it looks like now. In 2 months this happened. Wouldn't you like to have those contractors working on your kitchen? And this is the Stockholm in the 21st century. She has had 17 owners and 17 name changes since 1956. Here she is the Italia Prima, note the name, owned by a company in, of all places, Genoa, Italy. Although she has been elegantly redesigned and styled, you can still see the silhouette of the former Swedish-American Line's flagship and its distinctive bow. Now here's where our story takes a little bit of an ironic turn. These pictures of the former Stockholm, here the Italia Prima, show the ship being refurbished in Genoa, Italy in 2010. The dry dock in which she rests during her makeover is the very same one which held the Andrea Doria as she was being built, prior to her launch in 1951. As a side note, this same dry dock is now the final resting place of another ill-fated monarch of the seas, one which infamously ran aground off the Italian coast in Giglio in January of 2012. The Costa Concordia is now being dismantled, a process which will take until 2024. Back to the Italia Prima. One stipulation that the ship's owners insisted on was that prominently displayed in the ship's grand foyer is a portrait of the Andrea Doria in her prime, and one alongside it of the Stockholm after the collision. Today, in the 7 years since these pictures were taken, the Italia Prima was renamed the Athena, then the Astoria, and is now the MV Azores, presently owned by a Portuguese company. She still cruises the lucrative Mediterranean market, but now her hull is painted jet black. Her superstructure is white, and her funnel is red and yellow. She now bears a striking similarity to a certain Italian liner of 1956. The Azores now holds the record as the world's longest-serving ocean liner, having been at sea for an unheard of 70 years. The story of the Andrea Doria and the Stockholm is more than the tale of two ships which did not pass in the night. In the 6 decades since their fateful encounter, both vessels have taken on legendary proportions. They became symbols of national pride and renaissance following a dark period in our world history. They epitomized grace, beauty, epic tragedy, and the charm of a bygone era, when these ocean monarchs sailed the seas in style and substance. People embraced these floating works of art and technology as more than mere transportation. These ships, and all of the great ocean liners of their time, were imbued with distinctive personalities and represented civilization at its finest. The loss of any one or all of them is a profound sadness from which we will never fully recover. Thank you for your kind attention. I know you have refreshments waiting for you, but if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them either now or during refreshment time. Yes, sir.
If both ships interpreted their radar as being at 5 miles away, how did they conclude that the Stockholm was at fault because they misread their radar?
The Maritime Academy concluded the Stockholm was at fault because the Stockholm misread their radar long before the Doria did. And since they took the initial action, in other words, if they hadn't moved, the Doria would have passed. But because they moved, it caused the Doria to move. And because the Stockholm knew the ship was moving, but it had them moving in the exact opposite direction because they couldn't see the lights. So because of the actions the Stockholm was taking, the Doria was taking actions as well. It knew where the other ship was, but the Stockholm did not know where the Doria was. Again, the saying of the day was, it couldn't have happened, it shouldn't have happened, but it happened. Because certainly in 1956, the technology existed for this not to have happened. But it did.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
We were told that this was going to be a compelling, thank you on behalf of the Hudson Historical Society.
Thank you very much.
This is going to be a compelling program, a little bit long, but truly compelling, and I think we can all agree that that's exactly what it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Are you going to be able to stay around?
Yes,
for a few-
well, we will
Okay,
be here for a
so
while.
They'll be around, you can ask questions. With that said, we have refreshments.
Don't forget the refreshment. Ooh. That's why Lucy and I came. We're
Yeah,
refreshment.
And please see this, this is of maritime import that there's probably nothing like it in the entire world. Wasn't there
It
also,
was a very interesting, because even still, no matter how hard he tried, he got the wing of the plane.
yeah,
And that was just because he was shooting over the pilot, because he was over here, the pilot was here, he was shooting over the pilot to get that.
and he was trying to,
Trying not to throw up.
not, right.
Yeah.
The, there was a movie that came out, there was a fictional account, and it was, one of the themes of it was that there was a woman trapped,
Okay, I
and
think I
her
yeah.
husband was told to leave,
Yeah.
and he refused. And because he refused, people came back and freed the wife. And that was
Yeah.
the basis of the movie.
Of the movie, yeah. To
I
my
don't- I don't remember.
to my knowledge, that did not happen. But
There was somebody who was trapped.
there was some. Oh, there were several people trapped, but they were freed by the crew before. Because again, it was 2.5 hours before the captain let anybody leave the ship. So the crew had time to save who could be saved. But the people who died instantly. And there were 5 who died later on. But
I have one question.
Okay.
So, Andrea
I hope I have an
Doria
answer.
was a military general. He
Yes.
was a man.
Yes.
Yet you continuously refer to the ship as a she. Why
Right.
is that?
Because our culture refers to ships as she.
Okay.
It's always, help me out here,
Well,
the
like the
feminine
Yorktown.
pronouns. It's like the
Yorktown.
Yorktown. Battleships, the Lexington, the Yorktown, the Arizona, they're all referred to as she.
Okay.
Because ships are always referred to as she. I don't know why. It goes way, way, way back to when they had sails, but that's why. And that's why I always start at the beginning saying Andrea Doria was not a woman, because the name sounds like it could be a woman.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
Or do
The
you
only
want
two
us-
people in the room with a
by
tie.
the-
Oh,
yeah.
there.
That'd be good. Get the
Oh, okay. Well, yes. Well, okay.
picture. And would
There
you
we
like
go.
anybody else in this picture?
Yeah,
It's up.
Jeanette?
Where's Jeanette?
Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. Uncle Truman, thank you for your service. Appreciate that.
Yeah, well, my daughter is in the Navy.
Oh, really?
Was in the
Oh, this wasn't you. Oh.
That's right.
This wasn't you. This is your daughter. The hat.
Paul's gonna
Oh,
take.
she gave it to me.
Oh, that's what I mean, yeah.
She was on the Truman.
That's, yes, your daughter was,
went
yeah.
sailing with her.
Oh my gosh.
The Truman took us out
Oh my gosh.
trips and feet and shooter things.
Oh my goodness. Oh wow, that's wonderful. That's great. Those are great memories. Oh, we got over there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I was amazed. Don't stand in the way of the press here. Thank you.
Sir, how
Yes.
did you develop your love or interest in the Andrea Doria? Like you're so precise and you have all the facts. So how did you develop that?
Started back when I was in high school.
Yes.
I became interested in the Titanic. And this is way before the ship was found. Nobody knew where it was. I became interested in the Titanic, and I read everything I could about the Titanic.
Oh,
And then in history class in high school, we talked about the Lusitania. And so I read everything I could about the Lusitania. So ships have always been kind of in the back of my mind since I was in high school.
oh,
And
okay. Well,
when it came to this, I didn't know anything about the Andrea Doria until
No,
a few years after that. My parents were on their honeymoon when this happened, and they just happened to casually mention it. Oh, really? And so then I got what books I could get and found out about the ship. And then it was just coincidental that this friend of mine went to school with the guy who took the pictures, and that's what really got me
are
interested.
you a teacher of history?
I'm not, no.
No. Oh, all right.
not.
Well, you do a wonderful
Oh,
job.
thank you.
Maybe you should be.
Maybe I should be.
That was wonderful.
Oh, you need your equipment back, don't you?
Also need a mailing address for the DVD.
Okay. Well, let me take this out first.
I went to Berlin. I saw you in Berlin.
Oh,
I went
yeah.
with Jeanette and I.
Oh,
Yeah, so we had the preview with.
I was going. I hope the story came out the same way both times.
It was great. It was great.
Oh, thank you.
And I like seeing it twice. I found out more, I heard more, and I understood more.
Yes, Jeanette said, it's just so much to take in. It's kind of.
Great job.
Oh, thank you very much. You just want to mail it.